I take offense to the chairman pointing out that all CEOs are corrupt because they're millionaires. You know, if you make a lot of money, you're corrupt. Yet it's bothering to me because, Mr. Chairman, you yourself have been very successful, rightfully so.
Did mention my name, I think. And I think you got an all-time record here. You've made more misstatements in a shorter period of time than I have ever heard.
Please correct me.
Well, if I'm worth $8 million, excuse me.
It's all public.
Excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right? Will you make that commitment right now to guarantee paid sick days to all of your workers? That's not a radical demand. It really is not.
Senator, I share your focus on our employees. I will commit to continuing to discuss with them important quality of life issues with our local craft colleagues.
In all due respect, you sound like a politician here, Mr. Shaw.
Senator, we're going to do what's right for the citizens of
What's right is to cover their health care needs. Will you do that?
Everything is on the table, sir.
Incredibly, last year, drug companies hired over 1,700 lobbyists. There are 535 members of Congress. They got 1,700 lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry, 3 lobbyists for every member of Congress. Meanwhile, as Americans die because they cannot afford the medications they need, the pharmaceutical industry makes higher profits every year.
We have very increased complexity.
Yeah, you have complexity, but you have money for stock buybacks by the billions, and you guys became billionaires. That doesn't seem too complex to me. Mr. Bancel literally became a billionaire overnight and is now worth over $4 billion. He was also able to secure a golden parachute for himself worth another $926 million after he leaves the company. Should people in our country and around the world get sicker and sometimes die because they cannot afford the outrageous prices that the drug companies are charging? Is it morally acceptable to say, I have a drug here that can cure you, save your life, and I'm sorry you can't afford the $50,000 that it cost? Is that the moral values of the United States of America? Year after year, with very little debate, we pour hundreds of billions of dollars into the military-industrial complex. This year, it's about $900 billion. While defense contractors make huge profits, while the Pentagon remains unaudited with massive waste and fraud, we now spend more than the next 10 nations combined. Enough is enough. It's time to change our national priorities, and cutting military spending by 10% is a good way to begin.
Over 1,400 children, women, and men, they were brutally murdered. 31 Americans were killed, and dozens remain missing or held hostage. In the wake of such a despicable series of attacks, we must ensure that our taxpayers here, that our taxpayers are not being, their dollars are not being sent to aid these terrorist killers. 2 years ago, one of our own State Department officials in the Biden administration, he acknowledged that the possibility that aid to the Palestinians could find its way into Hamas' hands. That's unacceptable. And that's why Senator Rick Scott's Stop Taxpayer Funding of Hamas Act is so critical right now. It simply states that no U.S. taxpayer dollars would be authorized to Gaza until the president certifies to us, to Congress, that there are measures in place to prevent any taxpayer dollars from benefiting terrorist organizations.
The United States of America, all of us, condemn this act. And in my view, the State of Israel has the absolute right to defend itself against Hamas and terrorism in general. No debate on that. But what I ask my colleagues to also consider is that while we fully appreciate the horrific attack by Hamas against innocent people of Israel, I ask you also to understand that right now there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza who have lost their homes. They've been thrown out of their homes. They have no food, they have no water, they have no fuel. And I remind my colleagues that half of those people are children. Half of the people in Gaza are children. So yes, we are united in doing everything we can to destroy Hamas and their terrorism. But I implore you, do not take Hamas's inhumanity and brutality and terrorism against children who are 3 or 5 years old. I ask you to think for a moment. Think about it. I have a state, represent the state of Vermont, 630,000 people. 1 million people, most of them are poor. They got nothing to begin with. Before this whole business, Gaza was one of the most desperately poor places in the world. Youth unemployment, 75%. Many of their people depended on the UN for basic survival. So what I'm asking people to take a look at is to understand what our country is about and what our country must not be involved in is making the horrific and miserable situation in Gaza even worse. Have you ever threatened, coerced, or intimidated a worker for supporting a union?
I've had conversations that could have been interpreted in a different way than I intended.
You're a billionaire, and they are your employees. The imbalance of power is extreme, and that is why people want to come together to form a union.
This monarch of billionaire, let's just get at that, okay? I grew up in federally subsidized housing. Let me finish. I grew up in federally subsidized housing. My parents never owned a home. I came from nothing. Yes, I have billions of dollars. I earned it. No one gave it to me. And I've shared it constantly with the people of Starbucks. And so anyone who keeps labeling this billionaire thing, it's
Mr. Schultz, I don't mean to cut you off. We have time limits here, and you have
Well,
the
I just think-
opportunity. I'm not cutting you off.
It's your moniker constantly. It's unfair.
No, it is not.
earned-
You have had more time. I've
Well-
been generous with the time.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. What was going on in Israel before Hamas's terrorist attack? What was going on there? That country had the most right-wing government in its history, a cabinet that included outright racist ministers who consistently dehumanized the Palestinian population. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, was under indictment for a litany of corruption charges, and many believe that Israel's intelligence, or lack of intelligence, on October 7th had everything to do with his government's preoccupation with his political problems. Before the war, this right-wing Israeli government had systematically undermined the prospects of peace. Netanyahu and his extreme partners in the cabinet had worked to marginalize Palestinian voices committed to peace, pursued settlement policies designed to foreclose the possibility of a two-state solution, stymied economic development in Palestinian areas, and passed laws that entrenched systemic inequality between Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. Mr. Shaw, you indicated in response to a question from the chairman that you, quote, "I'm committed to doing what's right," end quote. Well, I think all of us are committed to doing what's right, but the devil is in the details. Mr. Shaw, Wall Street, about a decade ago, in order to increase the profits they were earning in the rail industry, implemented a program called Precision Scheduled Railroading. The result of that is that Norfolk Southern reduced its workforce by almost 40% over 6 years. Meanwhile, in fact, Wall Street's goal was achieved. Profits soared for Norfolk Southern. You made over $3 billion in profits last year. I have been told by workers who work for your company and other rail companies that they are now being asked to do more work with fewer workers, and that includes safety inspections. So well before this disaster in East Palestine, we have been told about the potential safety hazards. Will you make a commitment right now to the American people that you will lead the industry in ending this disastrous precision scheduled railroading, which has slashed your workforce and made railroading much less safe? Yes or no, will you make that commitment?
Senator, I understand your concern, and I share that concern. If you'll permit, I have a couple points on that. I became CEO in May of last year. Ever since that point, Senator, we've been on a hiring spree.
You will not deny what you're trying to do is rebuild from the massive layoffs that took place. My question back to you again. Wall Street, not the industry, imposed this on the industry. Wall Street said we're not making enough money. Cut workers, cut workers, cut workers, even if it endangers safety. My question to you, very simply, sir, will you lead the industry in doing away with precision scheduled railroading?
Senator, in December of last year, I charted a new course in the industry. And I said we're going to move away from a near-term focus solely on profits, and that we're going to take a longer-term view that's founded on our engagement with our craft employees who are so critical to our success.
When you talk about your employees, the entire country, I think, was shocked to learn a number of months ago that your employees, rail workers, who work in a dangerous job in all kinds of weather, had zero paid sick days. Now, I know that is beginning to change, but I would ask you, given the fact that Norfolk Southern provided $10 billion in stock buybacks recently, can you tell the American people and your employees right now that in order to improve morale in your workforce, that you will guarantee at least 7 paid sick days to the 15,000 workers you employ? I do know you've made some progress. You increased paid sick days for some of your workers. Will you do what most Americans think is pretty obvious, that when you get sick, you get guaranteed paid sick days? Will you make that commitment right now?
Senator, with our latest agreement with our employees, which included a historic 24% wage increase and access to premium health care benefits, we immediately pivoted to talking to each of our local...
I've been deeply involved. I introduced the amendment on the floor. I know the issue. But what I'm asking you right now, you provided paid sick days to some of your employees. I got it. Thank you. Will you now do it what we get here in Congress? I am not hearing you make that commitment to guarantee that to all of your workers. Clearly, we should have that for every worker in America. I'm not hearing that commitment. Will you make that commitment, sir?
Senator, I'm committed to continuing to speak to our employees about quality of life issues that are important to them.
All right. Well, I'm chairman of the Health Education Labor Committee. We look forward to having that discussion. You talked about covering the needs of the people of East Palestine. Does that include paying for their health care needs? All of their health care needs?
Senator, we're going to do what's right for the citizens of East
What's
Palestine.
right is to cover their health care needs. Will you do that?
Everything is on the table, sir.
And you've been in office for 28 years, and you and your wife have immersed a wealth of over $8 million. And in fact, your quote on being wealthy and being a millionaire was, well, if you write a bestseller, you can be a millionaire too. If you can be a millionaire, why can't Mr. Schultz and other CEOs be millionaires and be honest too? If that's the case, then why is it that Mr. Schultz, who actually creates jobs and a bestseller of a book, isn't creating any jobs? Why is it that he's corrupt and you're not? Why is it that all CEOs are corrupt because they're wealthy, and yet our chairman, who is wealthy, and I'm glad you are, you're not? But when you lean towards socialism, what you think is government is the answer and unions are the choice. What is wrong with the CEO defending his company and openly saying that he is providing good benefits and paying higher than everybody else, but yet if you're not part of a union, you're also paying starvation wages? What hypocrisy! What bias? Chairman, you are chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee. We shouldn't have a biased approach. We should have what's best for America.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
If I'm worth $8 million, that's good news to me. I'm not aware of it. That's a lie. All right? Number two.
Part of public records.
You're probably looking at some phony right-wing internet stuff. It ain't true.
No,
All right? You should read beyond that. It is not true.
it's
All
part
right?
of public records.
No, it is not public record.
Okay. Well, you made
It is not
$1.7 million on your book.
public record.
You made
All right? It is-
1.7 on your book.
Excuse me. I've got the mic now. Number
you not
two,
make the statement
I
that if
have
you want to
the
be a
mic
millionaire?
now. I've got it.
Did you
had
not
your
make
time.
that statement?
You had your time.
Okay.
All right? You're not telling the truth. Second of all, you got no evidence that I have ever said that all CEOs are corrupt. I have never, ever said that.
Probably not all, but every time you talk
probably
about
not,
CEOs,
then
you do
shouldn't
say that.
Say it. Furthermore, what this hearing is about is whether or not you talk about being pro-union. Really, what this hearing is about is whether workers have the constitutional right to form a union. The evidence is overwhelming, not from me, but from the National Labor Relations Board, is that time after time after time, despite what Mr. Schultz is saying, Starbucks has broken the law and has prevented workers from joining unions to collectively bargain for decent wages and benefits. Today in America, we have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had, with the top 1% now owning more wealth than the bottom 90%, with CEOs now making 400 times what their workers are making, and with 3 people at the top owning more wealth than the bottom half of American society. Over the past 18 months, Starbucks has waged the most aggressive and illegal union-busting campaign in the modern history of our country. That union-busting campaign has been led by Howard Schultz, the multi-billionaire founder and director of Starbucks, who is with us this morning only under the threat of subpoena. Let us be clear about the nature of Starbucks' vicious anti-union efforts. The National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, has filed over 80 complaints against Starbucks for violating federal labor law. There have been over 500 unfair labor practice charges lodged against the company, and judges have found that Starbucks broke the law 130 times across 6 states since workers began organizing in the fall of 2021.
We've always believed that if we exceed the expectations of our people, they in turn will exceed the expectations of our customers. We are 100% committed to fulfilling our obligations as an employer under the National Labor Relations Act and are committed to good faith negotiations on first contracts for each unionized store.
Do you understand that in America, workers have a fundamental right to join a union and collectively bargain to improve wages, benefits, and working conditions? Do you understand that?
I understand, and we respect the right of every partner who wears a green apron, whether they choose to join a union or not.
Are you aware that NLRB judges have ruled that Starbucks violated federal labor law over 100 times during the past 18 months, far more than any other corporation in America?
Sir, Starbucks Coffee Company unequivocally, and let me set the tone for this very early on, has not broken the law.
Okay. Are you aware that on March 1st, 2023, an administrative law judge found Starbucks guilty of, quote, egregious and widespread misconduct, end quote, widespread coercive behavior, and showed, quote, a general disregard for the employees' fundamental rights, end quote, in a union organizing campaign that started in Buffalo, New York in 2021. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that those are allegations, and Congress has created a process that we are following, and we're confident that those allegations will be proven false.
All right. Mr. Schultz, before answering the following questions, let me remind you that federal law at 18 U.S. Code Section 1001 prohibits knowingly and willfully making any fraudulent statement.
I understand that.
Were you ever informed of or involved in a decision to fire a worker who was part of a union organizing drive?
I was not.
Were you ever informed of or involved in a decision to discipline a worker in any way who was part of a union organizing drive?
I was not.
Were you informed of or involved in the decision to withhold benefits from Starbucks workers in unionized stores, including higher pay and faster sick time accrual?
My understanding, when we created the benefits in May, 1 month after I returned as CEO, my understanding was under the law, we did not have the unilateral right to provide those benefits to employees who were interested in joining a union.
Am I hearing you say that you were involved in the decision to withhold benefits from Starbucks workers in unionized stores? Is that what I'm hearing?
It was my understanding that we could not provide those benefits under the law.
Mr. Schultz, have you ever asked a Starbucks worker, quote, if you hate Starbucks so much, why don't you go work somewhere else?
I'm glad you asked that question because I've read in the press that quote, and that's not exactly what I said. Can I tell the story? Do you mind?
I have some other questions. I'm sorry. There are a lot of people.
I think it's important to hear the facts.
All right, you'll have your chance. Will you commit to testifying in any trial where you personally are accused of breaking federal labor law, something that you have been accused of doing nearly 100 times since 2021?
Mr. Chairman, let me say under oath, these are allegations and Starbucks has not broken the law.
Okay. Mr. Schultz, were you informed of or involved in the decision to close all Buffalo area stores in November 2021, just days before area union elections, in order for Starbucks employees to listen to you give a speech on why they should vote against forming a union, a meeting the NLRB has determined was a violation of the law?
I think this is another area that I hope I get a chance to speak about. For the last 12 months, my involvement, my engagement, and my return to Starbucks has been primarily, I would say 95%, focused on the operations of our business.
Are you aware, Mr. Schultz, that an administrative law judge ordered you to record and distribute a video of yourself reading a notice to Starbucks employees about their rights under the National Labor Relations Act, how Starbucks violated those rights, and to assure that Starbucks will not infringe upon those rights in the future, and that this notice must be posted in all Starbucks stores and shared digitally to all of Starbucks employees? Are you prepared to read that notice?
No, I am not, because Starbucks Coffee Company did not break the law.
Under your leadership, Starbucks has repeatedly refused to bargain with any of the 7,000 workers in nearly 300 stores where workers have voted to represent themselves through a union. The first group of workers to win their election have been waiting more than 460 days to reach a first contract. Mr. Schultz, will you commit right now that within 14 days of this hearing, Starbucks will exchange proposals with the union, something it has refused to do for more than 450 days, so that meaningful progress can be made to bargain a first contract in good faith? Will you make that commitment?
Because the arrangement that was made by the union and the NLRB in Buffalo to negotiate one single store at a time, we have met over 85 times for a single store. We've tried to arrange over 350 separate meetings. We've said publicly, and I say it here again, that we believe that face-to-face negotiations is the way to proceed. And the reason I want to make that point is that there have been safety issues in which Starbucks managers have been outed on social media. There are privacy issues. We don't want to do it on Zoom. We are prepared to meet face-to-face on a single store issue.
Will you make a promise to this committee that you will exchange proposals with the union so that we can begin to make meaningful progress?
On a single store basis, we will continue to negotiate in good faith. That's what we'll do.
Starbucks walked out on our store's only scheduled bargaining session after just 30 minutes. On May 3rd, the company announced that partners who were organizing or had already unionized would not receive a series of important benefit increases that non-union stores would be granted. My partners, along with thousands of partners across the country, still do not have access to these benefits, nor do we have a company that is willing to sit across the table with us and bargain for them. This is part of my store's campaign story, but if you look to the 7,500 plus members of Starbucks Workers United, you will find thousands of stories that detail similar or more grotesque accounts of Starbucks behavior during their scorched earth union busting campaign. You cannot be pro-partner and anti-union. It's well past time for the company to bargain in good faith. Help us hold them accountable. Thank you for allowing partners to have a seat at this table alongside former CEO Howard Schultz, because that is significantly more than he was willing to offer. To Starbucks' new CEO, Laxman Narasimhan, you have an opportunity to chart a different course, to truly make Starbucks the different kind of company Schultz promised but failed epically to produce. This is a chance for your company to stop its unprecedented campaign of union busting and instead partner with us, your so-called partners, and our union to build a company that truly lives up to its stated progressive values.
Are our memories so short that we have learned nothing from the 2008 Wall Street crash?
The biggest bank collapse since the 2008 financial crisis.
The last time we really went through a situation like this was 2008.
Silicon Valley Bank's failure was the largest in the U.S. since the 2008 financial crisis.
The major banks that we are deregulating in this bill were forced to pay over $49 billion in fines for a wide variety of fraudulent and deceptive activity. These very same banks received a taxpayer bailout of $47 billion from the Treasury and trillions of financial assistance from the Federal Reserve. This legislation makes it more likely that we will see another financial crisis.
The bank stock lost 80% of its value this week, 60% in one day alone, yesterday. The entire banking industry is feeling the impact. U.S. banks at one point had lost over $100 billion in stock market value in just 2 days. And there are fears now that this could spread beyond banking to other parts of the economy.
And against my strong opposition, then Congress and the Federal Reserve provided the largest taxpayer bailout in the history of the world to these huge banks because they were too big to fail. But now, 10 years later, hoping that we forget all about that, these large financial institutions are back again. How pathetic is that?
Was it a mistake to roll them back, or do you disagree with her?
I don't think there's anything in this piece of legislation that would have changed the outcome had it not existed in what happened in Silicon Valley Bank.
The Congressional Budget Office told us that the legislation we are debating today will, and I quote, increase the likelihood that a large financial firm with assets of between $100 billion and $250 billion would fail, end of quote. That's the CBO. But I can honestly say that I have not heard one person come up to me and say, Bernie, we have got to deregulate 25 of the largest banks in this country with cumulative assets of $3.5 trillion. No one has ever come up to me and said that that is a major priority for the American people. Just 10 years ago, as a result of the greed and the recklessness and the illegal behavior on Wall Street, this country was plunged into the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. As a result of the illegal behavior of Wall Street, American households lost over $13 trillion in savings, which shattered retirement dreams, wiped out life savings, and made it impossible for kids to send their kids to college. Since the 1990s, the financial sector has given more than $3.2 billion in campaign contributions, and last year alone spent over $200 million on lobbying. You want to hear about the corruption of the American political system? Here it is. Since the 1990s, the financial sector has given more than $3.2 billion in campaign contributions, and last year alone spent over $200 million on lobbying. And that is why Congress will be spending day after day trying to make life easier for these large financial institutions, while at the same time ignoring the needs of working families. No, we can't get a bill on the floor of the Senate that will lower the cost of prescription drugs. We can't do that. The American people overwhelmingly want us to act on gun violence. Can't do that. We're not able to protect the 1.8 million young people who are eligible for the DACA program. We can't do that. But we can spend a week or two worrying about the needs of some of the largest financial institutions in this country. And that, Mr. President, is why the American people are disgusted with what goes on in Washington, D.C. The NIH and other federal agencies work with Moderna to research, develop, and distribute the COVID vaccine that so many of our people have effectively used. While Moderna may wish to rewrite history, it is widely acknowledged that both Moderna and the NIH created this vaccine together. U.S. taxpayers spent $12 billion on the research, development, and procurement of the NIH Moderna COVID vaccine. And here is the thank you that the taxpayers of this country received from Moderna for that huge investment. They are thanking the taxpayers of the United States by proposing to quadruple the price of the COVID vaccine to as much as $130 once the government stockpile runs out. At a time when it costs less than $3 to manufacture the vaccine. My question to you is, given the fact that you have made billions of dollars, that your company has made huge profits, on behalf of the taxpayers of this country, will you reconsider your decision to quadruple the price of the vaccine?
So, Chairman Sanders, what we have to do is to deal with the complexity I described, and I'm happy to go into more detail for this hearing. This is not the same product. We used to have 10 doses in each vial. Now we're going to have every vial will have a different dose. This is not the same
I understand it, but quadrupling the price is huge, and I would hope very much that you will reconsider that decision. It's going to cost the taxpayers of this country billions of dollars. Is that something you can do?
The volume we had during the pandemic gave us economies of scale we won't have anymore.
Am I hearing from you that, in fact, you are prepared not to charge $130 for a vaccine to the U.S. government, but less than that? Is that what I hear?
What I'm saying, Mr. Chairman, is there's a list price. It depends if it's a single-dose product or pre-filled syringe product. There's a list price around $130. And then with different customers, there are going to be discussions.
But, that's an issue that many have raised. We have no transparency in pricing. It is a totally insane situation. Everybody pays a different price. The United States government helped you develop that vaccine. It is a huge consumer. Are you prepared to substantially charge less for the vaccine to the United States government and our agencies?
Given the situation at hand, Mr. Chairman, we have no idea of the volume that we need this year. We have very increased complexity.
Yeah, you have complexity, but you have money for stock buybacks by the billions, and you guys became billionaires. That doesn't seem too complex to me. Let me ask you this question, at least. The United States pays, the people in our country pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs in general. something this committee will work on. Will you at least tell us today that the price you are charging for the vaccine will be lower than what other countries around the world are paying? Or once again, we're going to pay the highest prices?
So, Mr. Chairman, the price will depend on the value in each country. The cost of healthcare is different in each country.
That's not the answer. That's a whole, all right. I'm asking you a simple question. Your vaccine was developed with the help of the United States government. I am asking you whether or not we're going to continue to pay the highest prices in the world for that vaccine. I understand everything is complex, but I also understand you have money for stock buybacks and exorbitant compensation packages for yourself. Will you at least tell the taxpayers of this country that the price we pay for the vaccine will be less than other countries?
I cannot say that the price will be lower than other countries.
All right, let me ask you this. You know, when you talk about value, it's an interesting philosophical concept. In your judgment, what does value mean to a woman who lost her husband because the family cannot afford the price, the outrageous price of a prescription drug? Is that a value that we should consider, or is that a value that we should consider?
We believe in access, Mr. Chairman. And as I said, our products, we're going to work really hard for the uninsured, that they are available for no cost.
And I understand. I'm maybe asking you a broader question than just Moderna. Senator Markey mentioned Pfizer having a cancer drug for $175,000, I believe is what he said. All right?
Another company.
That's another company, of course, I know that. But I'm asking your statement. You talk about value, and the value is, well, we've helped the economy and we've done all these things. True enough. But what about the value of the human lives that are lost or the suffering while companies make billions and people can't afford the price? Is that a value to be considered?
Of course, Mr. Chairman, we need to work together, industry and the governments and all the players in the healthcare system to figure out how do we make sure the products are available. I completely agree with you. We work hard to make medicine and to do science to help people.
Alexander Fleming developed penicillin, a huge advance for medicine, saved, what, millions of lives? Frederick Banting sold his intellectual property for $1 for insulin. All right? What do you think about those guys and those scientists who said, you know what, our function in life is to create wonderful drugs that will ease human suffering and save lives, not to become excessively rich? Do you think they were crazy?
I think what they did was very noble. I think what we have to do is to invest in the technology. If we didn't have a technology when the pandemic happened, there would have been no Moderna vaccine, Mr. Chairman.
Look, we all agree that we need the technology, but what I am asking you, and some of my friends here are saying, is that the only thing that motivates you is to become a billionaire.
That's not true.
All right, but then can we have a science where people get paid well? I have no problem with Moderna making money, but you're hearing here massive cash paybacks, you becoming a multi-billionaire. Should we develop a counterculture, perhaps, which says your motive is not just making billions, but developing all of the drugs we need for the terrible diseases that this world faces?
And that's what we're doing, Mr. Chairman. That's why Moderna is a different company. Our number one investment this year is in R&D. As I mentioned, $4.5 billion.
How much do you put in stock buybacks?
Sorry?
How much do you provide in stock buybacks?
We have not decided yet as a board. The number of a stock buyback that's still open is $2.8 billion, I think. Yeah. Our number one priority is R&D. If we could invest more in R&D, we would. The challenge we have is phase 3 studies takes time to happen, Mr. Chairman.
Let me ask you this. And again, I'm directing it to you, but it really applies to the whole industry. If we were to say to you, if the government were to say to you, look, we're interested in cures in cancer, obviously, diabetes, all the other, Alzheimer's, all the other terrible illnesses we face. We are prepared to make sure that your company makes a good profit. Maybe you don't become a multi-billionaire, but you make a good profit. And if you develop a cure for that particular disease, you're going to make money on it, but we're going to take the intellectual property and make it available to the whole world so that people all over the world at a very reasonable price will be able to benefit from that discovery. You make money, the world benefits. Everybody affords it. What do you think about that concept?
So what is really hard in this industry, Mr. Chairman, is the risk of failure. Most drugs fail. 90+% of drugs in clinical trial fail, as you are aware. And that's what makes it really, really hard.
But if we said to you,
Yeah.
all right, we're going to cover, you're not going to fail, you'll be compensated. All right, we're willing to pay you good money. You're going to get rich, maybe not a multi-billionaire. You'll do very, very well. We'll cover the risk. But if you succeed, that formulation is going to be available to people all over the world so that they can get that drug. We covered the risk. What do you think about that?
I will have to look into the details, Mr. Chairman, because, again, the risk is, I don't know how you manage the risk. I mean, are you suggesting in that thought process that the government will pay all of R&D of the entire industry?
Exactly what I'm suggesting.
Oh, okay.
That's the deal. We're going to cover the R&D. You succeed. You're going to make profit, but the product goes all over to the world so that people can afford it.
I think we'll have to understand the details to have an opinion.
See,
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Markey made the point that I think millions of people appreciate. You can come up with all the great drugs in the world. We appreciate that. But if people can't access them, or they go broke, or they go bankrupt having to buy them, it doesn't mean anything to those people. And certainly, by the way, we're talking about America, the wealthiest country on earth. What about Africa and poor people around the world? Should they die because they cannot afford that prescription drug? But it turns out that on one of the most important matters facing the American people, Democrats, Republicans, independents, progressives, moderates, and conservatives are all united. And they are united on the need to take on the outrageous corporate greed in the pharmaceutical industry and to substantially lower the incredibly high prices we pay for prescription drugs in this country. On that issue, the American people are quite united. Today, millions of Americans are forced to make the unacceptable choice between feeding their families or buying the medicine they need to ease their pain or to stay alive. Seniors from Vermont to Alaska are forced to split their pills in half because they don't have enough money to fill their prescriptions. Madam President, all over this country, every state in this country, the American people are asking some pretty simple questions. They want to know, how does it happen that in the United States we pay by far, not even close, the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs? How does that happen? Why is it, people are asking, that nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans cannot afford the prescriptions that their doctors write? Think about how crazy that is. People walk into a doctor's office to get a diagnosis. Doctor writes out a script. They can't afford to fill that prescription. They get sicker. Maybe they end up in the emergency room. Maybe they end up in the hospital. Maybe they die. People are asking, how does it happen that nearly half of all new drugs in the United States cost more than $150,000 a year? $150,000 a year. How does it happen that in Canada and other major countries, same exact medications manufactured by the same exact companies are sold for a fraction of the price that we pay in America? Simple question. Question Democrats, Republicans, Independents, everybody wants an answer to that. Well, the truth is that the answer to that question, in my view, is not complicated. And in fact, it can be summed up in just 3 words, and that is unacceptable corporate greed. Unacceptable corporate greed. Is it morally acceptable that the business model of the pharmaceutical industry today is primarily not to create the life-saving drugs we need, for cancer, Alzheimer's, heart disease, diabetes, and so many other terrible illnesses, but rather through their excessive greed to make as much money as they possibly can. There was once a time when the inventors of life-saving drugs were not obsessed with making huge sums of money, but were instead obsessed with ending the terrible illnesses that plagued humanity. In 1921, Dr. Banting, along with two other scientists at the University of Toronto, invented insulin, drug we're hearing a whole lot about now. When Dr. Banting was asked why he wouldn't patent insulin and why he sold the rights to his invention for $1, he replied, quote, "Insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world," end of quote. Frederick Banting. While Dr. Banting sold his patents for insulin for $1 so that humanity could benefit from his discovery, I should point out that Eli Lilly, one of our nation's largest drug companies, has increased the price of insulin by 1,200% over the past 27 years to $275, while it costs just $8 to manufacture. Selling it for $275 costs $8 to manufacture. Not quite the spirit of Frederick Banting. Now is the time to stand with the American people and substantially lower prescription drug prices in our country. And the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee is going to be actively involved in that process. Every year, despite partisan, sometimes very contentious, partisan fights on all manners of things, you name it, big fights going on, Congress somehow comes together very quietly, little debate, to vote for the one thing that they agree on, and that is more and more money for the Pentagon. And right now, despite all of the enormous needs facing working families in this country, over half of the federal discretionary budget goes to the military. Got it? Over half of the federal discretionary budget goes to the military. Madam President, I support a strong military. People don't have to convince me why we need a strong military. But I will oppose this legislation, this defense authorization bill, for four major reasons. First, more military spending right now is unnecessary. The United States remains the world's dominant military power and is in no danger of losing that position. Alone, we account for roughly 40% of global military spending. This comes despite the end of the war in Afghanistan and despite the fact that the United States now spends more on the military than the next 10 countries combined, most of whom are our allies. We spend more than the next 10 countries combined, most of whom are our allies. Last year, we spent more than 3 times what China is spending on the military and more than 10 times what Russia spent. And while this year's Defense Authorization Act would merely match the Pentagon's record-breaking request, in most recent years, Congress has seen fit to give the Department of Defense more money than it even asked for. Imagine that. According to the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, over an 11-year period, the Pentagon returned an astonishing $128 billion in excess funds to the Treasury. In other words, we gave them so much money, they couldn't even spend it, and they had to return some of that. So that's reason number one why I oppose this legislation. Number two, the Pentagon cannot keep track of the dollars it already has, leading to massive waste, fraud, and abuse in the sprawling military-industrial complex. The Pentagon accounts for about 2/3 of all federal contracting activity, obligating more money every year than all civilian federal agencies combined. Yet the Department of Defense remains the only major federal agency that cannot pass an independent audit, more than 30 years after Congress required them to do so. So we're throwing hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into the Pentagon. 30 years ago, Congress said, we want an audit. We want to know what's going on, a reasonable request. It's only been 30 years. We still have not gotten an independent audit. Madam President, last year, the Department of Defense was unable to account for over half of its assets, which are in excess of $3 trillion, or roughly 78% of what the entire federal government owns. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, reports that the Department of Defense still cannot accurately track its finances or capture and post transactions to the current accounts. Much of this additional military spending will go to line the pockets of hugely profitable defense contractors. It is corporate welfare by a different name. Almost half of the Pentagon budget goes to private contractors, some of whom are exploiting their monopoly positions and the trust granted them by the United States to line their pockets. Repeated investigations by the DoD Inspector General, the GAO, and CBS News have uncovered numerous instances of contractors massively overcharging the Department of Defense, helping boost these companies' profits to nearly 40%. Profit margins to nearly 40%, and sometimes as high as over 4,000%, while costing U.S. taxpayers hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. TransDigm, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon are among the offenders, dramatically overcharging taxpayers while reaping enormous profits, seeing their stock prices soar, and handing out massive executive compensation packages. Just one example. Lockheed Martin received $46 billion in unclassified federal contracts last year, returned $11 billion to shareholders through dividends and stock buybacks, and paid its CEO $25 million. These companies are fully reliant on the U.S. taxpayer, yet their CEOs make over 100 times more than the Secretary of Defense and 500% more than the average newly enlisted service member. If we're really looking at what true security is about, it means everything that we can do to improve the lives of ordinary Americans. True security is that we address the crisis of a declining life expectancy, the gap between the lifespan of the wealthy and the working class of this year is over 10 years. If you are working class in this country, you're going to die 10 years shorter than the wealthy. Is that not an issue of national security? Do we not want to make sure that all of our people, whether they're rich or poor or middle class, have the right to live full and productive and healthy lives? I think so. That's called national security. National security has to do with the issue of education for our kids. How are we secure if our young people, from childcare to graduate school, are not getting the quality of education? Madam President, there are millions of children who today in America, as we speak, are food insecure. There are days go by when they are hungry. How do we talk about national security and not talk about the crisis of childhood hunger, not to mention childhood poverty in general? How do we talk about national security when people are sleeping out on the street? How do we, in any sense of the word, talk about national security without understanding the weather in Texas, in the Southwest, is now hitting record-breaking levels. People are dying from the heat. Oceans are getting hotter. We're looking at drought. We're looking at extreme weather disturbances in my own state. Just several weeks ago, the worst natural disaster, torrential rainfalls that we have had since 1927. That is national security, where the people get forced out of their homes because of flooding, die from heat stroke. That's called national security. This body, the Senate, could decide to have 1 or 2 fewer ballistic missile submarines, saving almost $15 billion over the next decade. And we could put that money, and we'll go a long way toward housing the homeless or feeding the 5 million children in this country who are food insecure. Instead, day after day, here in Washington, many of my colleagues tell the American people that we just don't have the money. We can't do what every other major country on earth does, guarantee health care to all people. Can't provide affordable housing, can't provide affordable child care, can't provide nutrition to kids in America who are hungry. We just can't afford to do any of those things. But come the military budget and all the lobbyists around here from the defense contractors, my God, we can't stop throwing money at them. So, Madam President, what I would say is that the time is long overdue for our country to get our national priorities right. And one small step forward would be to say no to this very bloated and wasteful military budget and start reordering our priorities so that we pay attention to the needs of the middle class and working class and low-income people rather than just defense contractors. And with that, Madam President, I yield. Many of the families, and again, these are people thrown out of their homes. They don't know where they're going. They don't know who will accept them. They don't know if they're ever going back to their homes. And they're poor to begin with. And do we really want to deny those people aid from the UN and other agencies to feed the children, to provide water for them? Is that really what we are about? So, of course, it goes without saying that we have got to do everything that we can to make sure that not one nickel goes to the murderous Hamas organization. But at the same time, we have got to stand with the innocent women and children in Palestine who are suffering today and are facing an almost unprecedented modern humanitarian disaster. So, Madam President, today, in the midst of this crisis, U.S. and UN assistance in Gaza is aimed squarely at addressing the basic needs of the Palestinian people, including humanitarian aid and water and health programs. The U.S. and the UN go to great lengths to ensure that aid gets to the people who need it and is not diverted, as do trusted partners like Catholic Relief Services. The Israeli government itself recognizes the importance of this UN humanitarian aid and has long supported it. Today, in the midst of this horrific crisis, the United States and the international community are working to secure humanitarian access, and what media reports I have seen recently, we may be making some progress in that, so that the UN can get food and water and fuel and medicine to the 1 million or more people in Gaza who need essential supplies. That should be our focus. There are people now facing hunger. They are facing incredible desperation, and we cannot turn our backs on them. If you think this is going to be good for Israel, if you think that the suffering of the Palestinian people long-term is good for Israel, I think you are sorely mistaken. The world is looking at us, and the world understands that what Hamas did was terrible, but they don't want to see our great country turn its back on innocent women and children. That, in my view, is not what this country is about. This is a tough issue. There have been 4 wars there in the last 15 years. It ain't going to be solved tomorrow. But while we do our best to support Israel and destroy Hamas, please, let us not turn our back on the suffering people in Gaza. This is not what we should be doing, not what Congress should be doing, and therefore I object. The situation in Gaza today is a disaster. Congress must take action. The administration must take action. The world must take action. Today, 3 weeks after Hamas's barbaric attack against civilians in Israel, which began this war, many hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza are on the brink. Over the past 3 weeks, it is estimated that some 8,000 people in Gaza have been killed in bombings, including more than 3,000 children, and far more have been wounded. More than 1 million people in Gaza have been displaced from their homes, and some 670,000 are sheltering in UN installations where they are down to 1 liter of water per person per day. They lack sufficient food, water, medical supplies, or fuel. The hospitals and medical facilities there are in nightmarish conditions, with hundreds of babies in incubators and patients on life support at risk of death should the generators that sustain them run out of fuel. Corridors are lined with injured and displaced people, and overwhelmed doctors must turn patients away or operate without anesthesia or antibiotics. The humanitarian crisis is dire and getting worse by the minute. There must be a humanitarian pause now so that sufficient supplies, food, water, medicine, fuel, can reach the people of Gaza. If not, thousands more will die needlessly. We cannot allow that to happen. A stop to the bombing is critical to save innocent lives and secure the safe return of hostages. Mr. President, let us never forget the lives of all children. All people are sacred, whether they are Palestinian children, Israeli children, or American children, and we must do everything we can to protect them. But, Mr. President, if we are going to make any real progress in addressing this never-ending conflict between Israel and Hamas, there have been 5 wars in the last 15 years. We need to understand somewhat as to how we got to where we are today. If peace is to come to that troubled region, and if the Palestinian people are ever going to be able to enjoy lives of security and dignity, there must be a vision of where we go in the future. So let us be clear. The living conditions in Gaza before October 7th were horrific and inhumane, and that is before Hamas ignited the latest war. Before this conflict, in Gaza, nearly 80% of people there lived in poverty, and 2/3 were reliant on humanitarian assistance. Almost half the population and over 70% of young people were unemployed in Gaza. What kind of life could they look forward to? Electricity there was intermittent, with 11 to 12-hour blackouts every day. Water and sanitation systems were inadequate, and there were constant shortages of all basic necessities. Gaza was mostly cut off from the world, with Israel and Egypt severely limiting the number of people and types of goods that could go in or out. In fact, many observers describe Gaza as, quote, an open-air prison, end quote, and all of that is before October 7th. Mr. President, if we are serious about bringing freedom and dignity to the Palestinian people, that is a situation that can never be allowed to be returned to. The Palestinian people are entitled to much more than that. This last year saw record Israeli settlement growth in the West Bank, where more than 700,000 Israelis now live in areas the United Nations and United States agree are occupied territories. Despite that, the Israeli government authorized thousands of new homes for settlers and opened up new areas to construction while bulldozing thousands of Palestinian homes and schools and further restricting Palestinian movement. Legal experts agree these policies constituted nothing less than illegal annexation. All of these policies and more greatly increased tension in the West Bank. Before October 7th, 179 Palestinians had been killed in 2023, 179 Palestinians in the West Bank, which made it the deadliest year in 2 decades. Since October 7th, 121 more Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank, including some by settlers. These tensions were part of why so much of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, was deployed in the West Bank rather than the border with Gaza. And then came October 7th and Hamas's atrocities that began this latest and horrific war. The Hamas attack was unspeakable. Over 1,300 innocent men, women, and children in Israel were killed. Over 200 Israelis and Americans taken hostage, including young children and grandparents. Young people were gunned down in cold blood at a music festival, babies and older people brutally murdered in their homes. And let's remember that Hamas did not primarily target the military. No, they intentionally targeted civilians. Their goal was to kill civilians. Their attack was designed to provoke a response, and in that, they succeeded. Mr. President, many Israelis are now understandably furious, and they want to strike back forcefully. I think we can all understand that. But rage and revenge do not make useful policy. And here in the United States, after the attack on 9/11 in this country, we acted with rage and revenge, and I think many people now understand that that was a horrific mistake. Mr. President, killing innocent Palestinian women and children in Gaza will not bring back to life the innocent Israeli women and children who have been killed by Hamas. Like any other country, Israel has the right to defend itself and destroy Hamas terrorism. but it does not have the right to kill thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza. Israel does not have the right to endanger the lives of millions of Palestinians, half of whom are children, by shutting off water, food, fuel, and electricity. That type of action against a helpless and impoverished population is morally unacceptable and in violation of international law. Israel does not have the right to bomb an entire neighborhood to target one Hamas leader or installation. But that is what the Israeli government is doing. One need only look at the satellite imagery and photography of Gaza to see that this is not a carefully calibrated campaign. These are not surgical strikes. Yesterday, Israel struck the densely populated Jabalia refugee camp and killed a Hamas commander. But they also killed some 50 other people and injured hundreds more, though the exact toll is not yet known. And that was actually the fourth airstrike on that community. An October 9th airstrike killed 60, an October 19th airstrike killed 18, an October 22nd airstrike killed 30, according to outside researchers. UNRWA reported yesterday that their head of security, that is the United Nations Relief Agency, their head of security was killed along with his wife and 8 children. In total, 67 United Nations Relief Agency workers have been killed, and 44 United Nations facilities have been damaged since October 7th. Mr. President, the current Israeli strategy must end. Israel must begin the process of restoring water and electrical services to areas where they are still operable. The international community must also rush generators and solar capacity to Gazan medical facilities to address acute needs and reduce Israeli fears of diversion to Hamas. Israel will not stop going after Hamas, but it must do it in a very, very different way, and additional pauses will be needed. Mr. President, let me conclude by saying that Israel must also begin the process of laying out a political strategy. It cannot bomb its way to a solution. Such a strategy must include, as minimum first steps, a clear promise that Palestinians displaced in the fighting will have the absolute right to safely return to their homes, a commitment to broader peace talks to advance a two-state solution in the wake of this war, an abandonment of Israeli efforts to carve up and annex the West Bank, and a commitment to work with the Palestinian Authority to build genuine governing capacity. The United States must make it clear that these are the conditions of our solidarity. Just as we want justice for the Israelis murdered by Hamas, we also want justice for the Palestinian people. And that is not going to happen with Hamas. Palestinians need a state of their own, contiguous, with the freedom of movement and access that can sustain a vibrant economy. Mr. President, this will be a long and difficult road. It will take concerted U.S. and international support and a doubling down of our political commitment to a two-state solution. But the first step right now must be to stop the bombing and bring in as much humanitarian aid as possible.